He didn't know what to do with her. That was the first thing Reed Callum thought when he found the woman collapsed against the water trough behind his barn, her coat torn at the shoulder, her hands bleeding through strips of fabric she'd wound around her palms like makeshift bandages. It was 3 in the morning. The November wind was cutting hard across the flats, and she wasn't moving. He stood there longer than he should have, long enough that his dog, an old heeler named Suit, pushed past him and nosed at her face. She groaned, turned her head. He decided that was enough to work with. Her name was Iris Vane. She told him that much while he was cleaning the cuts on her hands at the kitchen table, her eyes moving constantly to the window like she expected something to come through the glass. She was 26 years old, though she looked younger, sitting there in one of his old shirts, her dark hair still damp from the well water she'd splashed on her face. She said she'd walked 11 miles from the Hargrove property east of town. He set down the cloth. Hargrove's land? I was working there. She watched his face. Was. He didn't ask more. Not yet. There was something in the way she said it, flat, finished, that told him the story wasn't going to be simple, and he had a sick horse in the barn that needed checking every 2 hours, and he was too tired to hold up both ends of a conversation that clearly wanted to go somewhere neither of them was ready for. He showed her the spare room. He told her the door locked from the inside. She looked at him for a moment. Really looked, the way people do when they're trying to measure whether kindness is the same thing as a trap, and then she nodded once and went in. He went back to the barn. His name was Reed Callum, and he'd been running the Callum station alone for 3 years. Since his father passed and his brother Eli moved to Denver and never came back except for Christmas. And even then, not every year. The station sat at the edge of the Powder River Basin in Wyoming, high enough that the winters arrived early and left late, and the land between was beautiful in a way that required a person to make peace with solitude first. Reed had made that peace. He wasn't sure when exactly. It had happened gradually, the way most important things do, until one morning he woke up and realized he didn't mind the quiet anymore. He'd stopped missing it being filled, which made the woman in his spare room a thing he didn't quite know what to do with. She was still there when he came in at first light. He found her at the stove, frying eggs in the cast-iron pan she'd found hanging above the burner, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who knew how to use a kitchen, but wasn't sure yet if she had permission. She'd already made coffee. The cups were on the table. He sat down. She put a plate in front of him without being asked. He ate half of it before he said, "You going to tell me what happened?" Iris sat across from him, wrapping both hands around her mug. "I found out what they're doing to the water." The Hargrove operation had been running cattle on that eastern stretch for 6 years. Harold Hargrove was the kind of man who wore expensive boots and shook hands hard and made sure every person in the 20-mile radius knew exactly what he owned. He'd hired Iris 8 months ago to manage his livestock records. She had a degree in animal science from the University of Wyoming, and she was good at it. And she'd needed work after her position at the county extension office dried up when funding got cut. She hadn't asked too many questions at first. She was there to do her job. But animals don't lie. That was something her grandmother had told her when Iris was small, and it turned out to be the most practical piece of wisdom she'd ever received. When Hargrove's cattle started dying, slowly, 1 or 2 a week, nothing dramatic, she'd started looking at the water. What she found in the creek feeding the southern pasture wasn't natural. Someone was introducing something upstream. She didn't know the compound yet, but she knew the symptoms. The cloudy discharge from the eyes, the stumbling gait in animals that had been healthy the week before, the way they stopped drinking even when they were thirsty, as if some instinct was telling them the water was wrong. She'd written it up, brought it to Hargrove directly. He'd smiled at her, offered her a raise. She'd understood then that Harold Hargrove already knew. She'd spent 3 weeks after that being very careful about what she looked at, what she wrote down, who she spoke to. She found the source. She documented it. She photographed it on the small camera she kept in her coat pocket that she'd bought secondhand in Casper, because it had no wireless connectivity and couldn't be tracked. And then 2 nights ago, she'd come back from a supply run to find her room at the Hargrove bunkhouse had been searched. Thoroughly. Professionally. By someone who knew how to put things back almost exactly as they'd been. Almost. She'd left that night with what she had. She'd walked because her truck was on Hargrove's property, and starting the engine would have woken people she didn't want to wake. 11 miles in the dark. In November, with bleeding hands because she'd gone through a fence the fast way when she heard horses. She laid it all out for Reed at that kitchen table while the coffee went cold between them, and Suit lay at her feet like he'd always been her dog. When she finished, Reed was quiet for a long time. "The creek that feeds your south pasture," she said, "does it come from the east?" He looked at her. Reed. She said his name like it was a tool she needed him to pick up. "Does your water come from the east?" He stood up slowly and went to the window. The barn was visible from here, the gray-brown shape of it against the pale sky. Inside that barn was a mare named Belle who'd been refusing water for 4 days. The vet had come twice and found nothing. Said it might be stress. Said to keep watching her. "Yes," he said. "It comes from the east." He didn't believe her all at once. That would be too easy. And Reed Callum was a man who'd been made careful by experience. But he believed her enough to pull his cattle off the south pasture that morning, enough to haul water from the north cistern instead, enough to call his neighbor Dell Rutherford and tell him to do the same without explaining why, just saying there might be a problem and Dell should trust him for now. Dell, who'd known Reed since they were in school together, said, "Fine." Iris spent that first day in the barn with Belle. She didn't ask permission. She just appeared there mid-morning with a bucket of the north cistern water and sat down in the straw near the mare's head and waited. She had a way with the animal that Reed noticed, but couldn't fully name. It wasn't showmanship. Nothing demonstrative about it. She just got very still and let the horse decide what she wanted to do with that stillness. By afternoon, Belle drank. Reed watched from the barn door and didn't say anything. The trouble arrived on the 4th day. A man named Durant came to the station in a truck with a Hargrove brand on the door. He was polite in the way that felt like a thin coat of paint over something rough underneath. He said Hargrove was concerned about a former employee who'd left suddenly and might be confused about something she'd seen. He said there were no hard feelings. He said if Iris was here, it would be best for everyone if she came back to have a conversation. Reed told him Iris wasn't there. Durant looked at the house for a moment, then back at Reed. "Mr. Callum," he said, "Harold Hargrove is a man who remembers the people who helped him. And the people who didn't." Reed held the doorframe and said, "I'll keep that in mind." He watched the truck until it was gone from sight. "I'll keep that in mind." He watched the truck until it was gone from sight. Then he went inside and found Iris in the kitchen, her back flat against the wall beside the window, the small camera gripped in both hands. "He's going to come back," she said. "With more. Probably. You should let me go." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white. "I don't want to bring this to your door." He pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, the same way he had that first morning. And he looked at her the same way he had then, like he was making an assessment, not performing one. "You said you have photographs." "Yes, and you know what compound it is? I sent a water sample to a private lab in Cheyenne before I left, under a different name. They'll have results in 3 days. He nodded slowly. "Then you need to be somewhere Durant can't find you for 3 days. Reed." "There's a line cabin up on the North Pasture Ridge," he said. "Been empty since October. No road to it that a truck can manage. You'd have to go on horseback." He paused. "Can you ride?" She looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of exasperation. "I have a degree in animal science from Wyoming." "That's not what I asked." "Yes," she said. "I can ride." He sent her up the ridge the next morning on a horse named Creed, who was steady on rocky ground, with enough supplies for 4 days and a two-way radio that he told her to use only if something was wrong. She had the camera. She had her documentation. She also, before she left, pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand. He opened it after she'd gone. It was a hand-drawn map of the creek system. His creek, the Hargrove Creek, the tributary that connected them, with 3 marked points and a series of numbers he recognized as water chemistry readings. At the bottom, she'd written, "If I don't come back, give this to Rutherford and tell him to call Wyoming, DEQ. Don't call the sheriff first. Hargrove's brother-in-law is Deputy Crane." He stood in the yard for a long time after reading it. The wind moved through the dry grass. Suit sat beside him and panted. He folded the paper and put it in his chest pocket. On the second day, Hargrove himself came. He arrived at midday, which was deliberate. Broad daylight, nothing threatening about it. Just a rancher paying a neighborly visit. He came alone, which was more threatening than if he'd brought 6 men, because it meant he was confident he didn't need them. Harold Hargrove was 61 years old, big through the shoulders, with a kind of face that had once been handsome and now was just powerful. He shook Reed's hand the way Durant had described, hard, like he was establishing something. "I'll be straight with you, Callum," he said. They were standing in the yard. Reed hadn't invited him inside. "The girl who came to you is troubled. Paranoid, our doctor says. She became fixated on the idea that there was something wrong with the water system. We tried to help her, but she ran before we could." Reed looked at him. "What girl?" Hargrove smiled. The smile didn't reach much past his lips. "Come on now. I had a woman come through 2 nights ago. Wouldn't say her name, stayed one night and moved on." Reed shrugged. "Happens sometimes, people cutting across land out here." "And you didn't ask her name. People out here at 3 in the morning don't usually want to be asked questions." Hargrove studied him. Reed looked back with the particular blankness that years of poker with his father had given him. "You got cattle on the south pasture?" Hargrove asked. "Move them north. Thought I saw some rust in the grass. Precautionary. That's smart." Hargrove nodded slowly. "Careful man." Trying to be. Hargrove put his hand out again. Reed shook it. "You'll let me know," Hargrove said, "if that girl turns up again." "Be the first call I make," Reed said. He watched him go. Then he went inside and called Del Rutherford and told him to drive past the North Creek tributary on his way home tonight and take a video on his phone without stopping and without getting out of the truck. And Del, God bless him, said fine without asking a single question. On the third morning, the radio crackled. Reed grabbed it off the kitchen counter so fast he knocked over his coffee cup. "It's me." Iris's voice was clear but clipped. "The lab called the secondary number. Results are in." He exhaled. "And selenium. At 3 times the safe threshold. Enough to cause progressive liver failure in cattle. Possibly kidney damage in humans with long-term low-level exposure." A pause. "It's not accidental, Reed. Selenium at this concentration in this creek system doesn't occur naturally. Someone is introducing it." The lab director said she's never seen a pattern like this outside of deliberate contamination. He sat down on the floor beside the counter, his back against the cabinet, and let that land. "The lab director," he said. "Will she testify?" "She said she will." "Then come down," he said. "Come down now." She came down at noon on Creed, who picked his way down the ridge trail with the calm attention of a horse who'd done this kind of thing before and found it reasonable. Iris rode with her coat buttoned to the collar and the camera tucked inside, and when she came into the yard and swung down, Reed was already there. She handed him the reins. He took them. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Del Rutherford got video," Reed said finally. "There's a white pipe at the creek bend that shouldn't be there. You can see it on his phone." Iris closed her eyes for just a moment, then opened them. "Okay. I know a man in Cheyenne," Reed said. "Environmental attorney, he's honest. Slow, but honest." He paused. "Slow, but honest." He paused. "And I already called Wyoming DEQ this morning, before you came down. I didn't wait." She looked at him. "You said not to call the sheriff first," he said. "You didn't say anything about DEQ." She laughed, a short, startled sound, like she'd forgotten she was capable of it. It changed her face completely. He noticed that. "We have to go to Cheyenne today," she said. "Truck's ready. Hargrove will know. He'll know I talked. He probably already suspects." Reed handed Creed's reins to the post and turned toward the house. "But suspecting's different from being able to do something about it. And by the time we're back from Cheyenne, there'll be enough people who know that doing something about it becomes a very bad idea for him." She followed him inside. What came after was not fast. That's the thing no one tells you about doing the right thing. It rarely resolves itself quickly, cleanly, dramatically. It moves through lawyers and government offices and signs statements and reviewed photographs and deposition schedules and waiting rooms that smell like old coffee. Wyoming DEQ opened a formal investigation within the week. The environmental attorney, a quiet man named Sol Briggs whose office walls were covered in topographic maps, filed a civil suit on behalf of Reed and Del Rutherford and three other affected landowners by the end of November. The lab director in Cheyenne gave her testimony in December. Harold Hargrove's operation was suspended pending investigation. Durant disappeared somewhere before anyone got around to subpoenaing him. Harold Hargrove himself got a lawyer, then two more lawyers, and said very little publicly. But the kind of silence that came off him now was different from the confident quiet of a man who controlled things. It was the silence of calculation. Bell recovered fully. Del Rutherford sent a case of decent whiskey to the Callum station with a note that said only, "Good neighbor." Del. Reed put it in the pantry and didn't open it right away because there was still work to do and winter to get through and a north fence line that had needed mending since September and kept getting pushed back. Iris stayed. She didn't announce this as a decision. It happened the same way trust had happened between her and Bell. Gradually, then without question. She moved from the spare room to a more permanent arrangement in the room at the end of the hall, and she started helping with the morning rounds. And she began taking phone calls from the DEQ investigator because she knew the water chemistry better than anyone, and the investigator had figured this out and found her number. One night in late January, they were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. It had become a habit, this, and Reed was reading through a document the attorney had sent, and Iris was writing up notes for the next deposition, and Soot was asleep under the table with his head on her feet. Reed looked up. She was frowning at something in her notes, tapping her pen against the table in the unconscious rhythm she had when she was thinking hard. He watched her for a moment. "I want to show you something," he said. She looked up. He took her out to the barn, which she thought was strange until he showed her the east corner, the section he'd framed out with new lumber 2 weeks ago, without saying why. There was a small room there now, properly insulated, with a workbench and shelves, and 2 electrical outlets, big enough for a desk, big enough for a person to work in it during the day without losing light. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. "The lab's going to need someone local to keep monitoring the creek," he said. "After the investigation closes, wherever it is will need somewhere to work." Iris turned and looked at him. He looked back at her with that same careful expression, not performing anything, not trying to say more than was true. "The creek runs through your land," she said. "It does. So you need a water quality manager. Seems like." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the January wind moved across the roof of the barn, the low sound of it constant and familiar. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and went silent. "I'd need to bring my equipment," she said. "Room's big enough. And I'll want to expand monitoring to the north tributary in spring." "That's your call," he said. "You're the one who knows the water." She looked back at the small room, the careful framing, the shelves he'd built at exactly the right height for someone her size, the window he'd cut into the east wall to catch the morning light. She didn't say yes then. She didn't have to. Some things don't need a word. But later, back at the table, she poured him the second cup of coffee without being asked. The same way she had that first morning in the shirt that was too big for her, with her eyes still going to the window. Except now, when her eyes went to the window, it wasn't in fear. It was just the habit of a woman who knew how to read the weather. And Reed Callum, a man who had made his peace with silence, found that it no longer felt like silence at all.